May 1945. A dusty Kansas train station, the air thick with summer heat and uncertainty. 5 German women step off the rails into enemy territory. They'd been told Americans were monsters, that their food was poisoned, that torture awaited anyone foolish enough to trust them. But when Sergeant Mac McCarthy approached their mess hall table carrying 5 tall glasses of thick white liquid topped with foam, these weren't the rations of war. These were milkshakes, rich, cold, excessive. The women laughed harshly and pushed them away without even tasting. But 23-year-old Greta noticed something in the American sergeant's eyes when they rejected his gesture. Something she never expected to see in an enemy's face. Genuine hurt. 3 weeks later, alone in the camp kitchen, she would finally take that first sip and discover that everything she'd been taught about America was a lie. One milkshake would change everything she believed about enemies and friends. Drop a comment and let me know what country you're watching from. These incredible stories of humanity crossing enemy lines deserve to be heard everywhere. The train wheezed to a stop with a final hiss of steam, and Greta Hoffman pressed her face to the grimy window one last time before stepping into her new reality. The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly on the small station platform, nothing like the gray skies she'd left behind in Germany. Dust swirled in lazy spirals around her worn boots as she joined the line of women shuffling toward the waiting military trucks. 5 of them in total, the first female prisoners of war ever to be processed at Camp Concordia, though none of them knew they were making history. They only knew they were alive when they'd expected to be dead. "Stay close," Irma Schwartz muttered in German, her voice carrying the authority of her 28 years and her role as their unofficial leader. "Remember what we discussed on the ship. Accept nothing. Trust no one. They'll try to break us with kindness before they show their true nature." Greta nodded automatically, but her eyes were already wandering past Irma's rigid shoulders to take in this strange new world. The propaganda posters back home had shown American cities as smoking ruins, American people as savage beasts barely contained by their corrupt government. But the buildings lining Main Street stood intact, their windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. And the people. "Dear Lord, would you look at that?" whispered Helga Richter, the youngest of their group at barely 21. She was staring at a house where children played on a painted porch swing, their laughter carrying across the still air. A woman in a clean floral dress emerged from the front door, shading her eyes with her hand as she watched their convoy pass. Greta held her breath, waiting for the shouts to begin, for rocks to fly through the air. This was the moment the Americans would reveal themselves when, faced with actual German prisoners in their midst. She'd seen what happened to captured American airmen in Berlin, the crowds that gathered, the fury that erupted like a dam bursting. But the woman on the porch simply raised her hand in what might have been a wave. One of the children beside her did the same, a gap-toothed smile visible even from this distance. "Propaganda," Irma said firmly, though her voice held less conviction than before. "They're putting on a show for us. Wait until we're behind barbed wire." The convoy turned a corner and Camp Concordia spread before them like a small city of rectangular buildings and neat gravel paths. The fence was there, yes, with its crown of wire and guard towers, but the buildings themselves were painted a cheerful yellow, and flower boxes sat beneath several windows. Greta had expected something from Dante's Hell. Instead, she found herself looking at what could have been a summer camp, if summer camps had armed guards. An elderly woman flagged down their truck as they approached the main gate, hurrying forward with a pitcher of water and a collection of mismatched glasses. The guard who'd been riding in front hopped down and had a brief conversation with her, his manner respectful rather than dismissive. When he climbed back up, he was carrying the pitcher. "The lady wants to offer you some water," he said in heavily accented German, his pronunciation making Greta wince. "Says it's hot today and you've come a long way." The 5 women exchanged glances. This had to be some sort of test, some way to identify the weak among them. But the water looked clean and cool, condensation beating on the outside of the pitcher, and Greta's throat felt like sandpaper after the long, dusty ride. Irma's jaw tightened. "We don't need American charity." but Helga was already reaching for a glass, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm so thirsty," she whispered. "What if it's just water?" The guard, a boy really who couldn't have been much older than Greta herself, simply held the pitcher steady and waited. His eyes were kind, she realized with a start. Not cruel or calculating, just kind. When Helga lifted the glass to her lips and drank deeply, he smiled and nodded approval. One by one, the others followed. Even Irma, though she drank with the air of someone accepting poison rather than refreshment. The water was cold and clean, tasting of nothing but itself. No bitterness, no strange aftertaste that might signal drugs or worse. Just water, freely given to enemies by an old woman who had no reason to care whether they lived or died. The processing area inside the camp was another shock to Greta's expectations. Clean concrete floors swept spotless, windows that actually let in light, and clerks who spoke to them in respectful tones rather than shouting orders. The medical examination was conducted by a female doctor who introduced herself and explained each step of the process, her German much better than the guards had been. When Greta flinched at the sight of the vaccination needle, the doctor paused and showed her the vial's label, explaining what it was for and why it was necessary. "We want to keep everyone healthy," she said simply. "Sick prisoners help no one." Their assigned barracks were perhaps the greatest shock of all. Real beds with actual mattresses, white sheets that smelled of soap and sunshine, and individual lockers for what few possessions they'd been allowed to keep. Greta ran her fingers over the smooth cotton of her pillowcase and felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't slept on clean sheets in over a year. "It's a trick," Irma said, but she was staring at her own bed with something that might have been longing. "They're fattening us up for something, making us soft so we'll tell them whatever they want to know." But when evening came and they were escorted to the mess hall, even Irma fell silent. The room buzzed with conversation in a dozen languages as male prisoners from various countries shared tables and stories. The smell of actual food, not the thin gruel they'd survived on during transport, but real cooking with spices and seasoning, filled the air. And the portions, when they were served, were larger than anything Greta had seen since before the war began. As they found seats at an empty table near the back, a figure approached carrying a tray. Sergeant Bobby McCarthy was a stocky man with prematurely gray hair and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. His uniform was pressed but not pristine, practical rather than showy, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm authority that came from experience rather than rank. "Welcome to Concordia," he said in his broken German, setting the tray down carefully. "I hope you find everything adequate." He struggled with the pronunciation, but his effort was genuine. "If you need anything, you ask me or another guard. We want your time here to be—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Bearable." It was then that Greta noticed what was on the tray. 5 tall glasses filled with thick white liquid crowned with peaks of foam that caught the light from the overhead bulbs. The glasses were frosted with cold, and when Mac pushed one toward her, she could smell vanilla and something rich and sweet that made her stomach clench with sudden, impossible hunger. "Milkshakes," Mac said proudly in English, then tried again in German. "Milch. Geschüttelt." The women stared. This wasn't the thin, bluish liquid they'd learned to call milk during the war years. This was something else entirely, thick and creamy and topped with what might have been whipped cream. It looked like something from a dream, like the desserts and fairy tales her grandmother used to tell. Irma laughed harshly, the sound cutting through the warm air of the mess hall like a blade. "More American excess while Europe starves." She pushed her glass away with the back of her hand, not even bothering to touch it. "Do they think we're children to be won over with sweets?" The others followed her lead almost automatically, their laughter joining hers as they rejected the offered treat. It was easier to laugh than to acknowledge the want that had flickered in Greta's chest at the sight of such plenty. Safer to reject than to hope. But as their laughter echoed across the mess hall, Greta caught sight of Mac's face. The change was subtle but unmistakable. A slight sagging of his shoulders, a flicker of something in his eyes that looked disturbingly like genuine hurt. Not the anger of an authority figure whose gesture had been spurned, but the quiet pain of someone whose kindness had been thrown back in his face. He gathered the untouched glasses without a word, his movements careful and controlled. Before he turned away, his eyes met Greta's for just a moment, and in that brief connection she saw something that made her breath catch. Not the cruel satisfaction of a captor playing games, but honest disappointment. The kind of disappointment that came from wanting to do good and having it rejected. As Mac walked away, carrying the tray of untouched milkshakes back to wherever they'd come from, Greta felt something shift inside her chest. Something small and uncomfortable, like a stone in her shoe or a splinter under her skin. For the first time since her capture, she found herself wondering not what the Americans might do to her, but what she might have done to them. The mess hall continued its cheerful buzz around her, but Greta sat in silence, watching Mac's retreating figure and thinking about the look in his eyes. Everything she'd been taught, everything she'd been told to expect, none of it matched what she'd seen in that moment of unguarded disappointment. And that realization, more than anything else that had happened in this strange day, filled her with a fear she couldn't name. Because if they were wrong about the milkshakes, what else might they be wrong about? The kitchen assignment came as a surprise to Greta, though she supposed it made sense from an administrative standpoint. Her English was better than the other women's, and someone needed to bridge the gap between the camp's culinary operations and the growing population of German prisoners. What she hadn't expected was Pearl Johnson. Pearl moved through the industrial kitchen with the kind of economical grace that spoke of years spent in cramped quarters, making the most of every motion. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and hands that spoke of honest work. When she looked up from the massive pot she was stirring and saw Greta standing uncertainly in the doorway, her expression was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply measuring. "You must be the German girl they told me about," Pearl said, her voice carrying the soft cadence of Kansas mixed with something else Greta couldn't identify. "I'm Pearl, cook's assistant." She paused, studying Greta's face. "You understand English well enough?" "Yes, ma'am," Greta replied, the formal address coming automatically from her upbringing. Something in Pearl's bearing commanded respect regardless of circumstances. Pearl nodded once, a gesture that seemed to indicate approval. "Good. We got 300 men to feed, plus however many women they keep bringing in. No time for playing translator." She gestured toward a pile of potatoes that seemed to reach Greta's waist. "You ever peeled potatoes before?" The work was harder than Greta had expected, but also strangely soothing. There was something meditative about the rhythm of peel, rinse, repeat, and Pearl worked beside her without the constant chatter that had filled the barracks. Instead, she hummed, "Spirituals," Greta realized after listening for a while, though the melodies were unlike anything she'd heard in German churches. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Greta asked after watching Pearl transform a mountain of vegetables into something that actually smelled appetizing. Pearl's hands never paused in their work. "My mama mostly, she cooked for the Johnson family, white folks who owned the big house where we lived, started helping when I was knee-high to a grasshopper." She glanced at Greta. "That was before the war, before things started changing around here." There was something in Pearl's tone that made Greta look up from her potatoes. "Changing how?" "Well," Pearl said carefully, "let's just say some folks in town weren't too happy when Sergeant McCarthy decided to hire a colored woman to work in a camp full of white prisoners. Even enemy prisoners." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Funny how that works, isn't it? Y'all are supposed to be the dangerous ones, but I'm the one they don't want their menfolk eating food prepared by." Greta felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd grown up in a Germany where such distinctions seemed distant and academic. There simply weren't many people who looked like Pearl in her small Bavarian town. But she wasn't naive enough to miss the implications of what Pearl was saying. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That doesn't seem fair." Pearl looked at her for a long moment as if reassessing something. "No, it doesn't. But Sergeant McCarthy, he fought for me. Told them I was the best cook's assistant he could find, and if they wanted decent meals instead of army slop, they'd accept his choice." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Man's got more backbone than most, treats everybody the same, whether they're wearing stripes or stars. Over the following days, Greta found herself looking forward to her kitchen shifts with an anticipation that surprised her. Pearl proved to be a patient teacher, showing her American cooking techniques that were completely foreign to her German training. But more than that, she offered something Greta hadn't expected to find in captivity: honest conversation. "You got family back home?" Pearl asked one morning as they prepared what seemed like enough breakfast for an entire regiment. Greta's hands stilled on the bowl she'd been stirring. "My parents, a brother, but—" She trailed off, unable to voice what everyone back home knew, but no one spoke aloud: that boys who went east rarely came back. Pearl nodded, understanding. "I got 2 sons, both grown now, both serving somewhere I can't pronounce." She cracked eggs with mechanical precision. "Funny thing about war, makes strangers of us all one way or another." It was during her second week in the kitchen that Greta began to really observe Mac's interactions with the prisoners. She'd see him making his rounds during meal times, stopping at tables not to enforce rules or issue orders, but simply to check in. He'd learn names, not just of American personnel, but of prisoners too. She watched him have a 5-minute conversation in halting Italian with a captured submariner, discussing the man's family back in Naples. She saw him help an elderly German infantry soldier fill out a Red Cross form to contact relatives. "He does that every day," Pearl observed, following Greta's gaze. "Learns a few words in whatever language he needs. Says everybody deserves to be called by their name, not just their number." "That's not what we were told Americans would be like," Greta admitted. Pearl set down her knife and really looked at her. "What were you told?" Greta found herself describing the propaganda she'd grown up with. Americans as brutal materialists who cared nothing for culture or human dignity, who would torture prisoners and laugh about it. As she spoke, Pearl's expression grew thoughtful. "Well now," Pearl said when Greta finished, "that's interesting, because you know what they tell folks around here about colored people? That we're lazy and dishonest and dangerous. That we can't be trusted around white women, that we'd steal everything we could get our hands on." She resumed cutting vegetables, her movements sharp and precise. "Amazing how stories spread, isn't it? How easy it is to make people afraid of folks they've never actually met." The parallel hit Greta like a physical blow. "But that's different." "Is it?" Pearl's voice was gentle, not accusatory. "I've been working in this kitchen for 6 months now. How many times you think I've stolen something? How many white women you think I've threatened?" Greta couldn't answer because the answer was obvious. Pearl worked harder than anyone else in the kitchen, treated everyone with respect, and had never so much as raised her voice. If the stories about her people were wrong, then what did that say about the stories she'd believed about other people? That afternoon, Mac stopped by the kitchen to discuss the next day's menu. Greta watched as he conferred with Pearl about dietary requirements for the new Polish prisoners who'd just arrived, asking her opinion on how to accommodate men who'd been subsisting on bread and thin soup for months. "Start them slow," Pearl advised. "Too much rich food too fast, and they'll be sicker than when they arrived. Maybe some broth first, with bread. Build them back up gradual-like." Mac nodded, making notes in his worn notebook. "What about the Germans? The women seem to be adjusting well to the portions." "Most of them," Pearl agreed, "though that Greta girl still looks surprised every time she sees how much food we prepare. Thinks she's starting to understand that plenty doesn't always mean waste." Greta felt her cheeks burn at being discussed, but there was no mockery in either voice. If anything, they sounded concerned. "She's a good worker," Mac said. "Learns fast, doesn't complain. Her English is getting better every day." He paused. "I think she's starting to see that we're not what she expected." "Takes time," Pearl replied. "Fear runs deep, especially when it's all you've known. But she's got good eyes. She sees you treating everyone fair, sees how you remember names and stories. That matters more than any speeches about American values." After Mac left, Greta found herself thinking about his daily rounds with new eyes. She began to notice things she'd missed before. How he always knocked before entering a barracks. How he listened when prisoners spoke instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. How he intervened when tensions arose not with threats, but with patient conversation. That evening, as she lay on her surprisingly comfortable mattress, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into night, Greta felt something she hadn't experienced since before her brother left for the front: curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. Not the fearful anticipation of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop, but genuine interest in what she might learn, what small kindnesses she might witness, what preconceptions might crumble under the weight of daily experience. Outside her window, she could hear Mac making his final rounds, his voice carrying softly through the Kansas night as he wished the guards good evening. In the kitchen that morning, she'd watched him drink coffee with Pearl, the two of them discussing their families with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned to see past surface differences to the humanity underneath. If an Irish Catholic sergeant from Boston could treat a black woman from Kansas as an equal colleague, and if that same sergeant could see German prisoners as individuals worthy of dignity rather than enemies to be broken, then perhaps everything she'd been taught about the impossibility of understanding across divides was just another story, one that dissolved in the presence of people willing to choose connection over fear. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, because if the stories about Americans were wrong, what other stories might be lies? And more importantly, what truths might be waiting to be discovered? 3 weeks had passed since that first evening in the mess hall, and Greta found herself alone in the kitchen earlier than usual, helping Pearl prepare for what had become a camp tradition she was still learning to understand. Birthdays apparently were celebrated here, not with the grim acknowledgement of another year survived that had become the norm back home, but with actual festivities that seemed to transcend nationality. Today it was Heinrich Müller's 40th birthday. A former accountant from Munich who'd been drafted into service as a supply clerk, Heinrich had mentioned the date in passing during one of Mac's evening rounds. Greta had assumed it would be noted and forgotten, the way such personal details disappeared into the machinery of war. Instead, Mac had quietly arranged for the kitchen to prepare something special. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen windows as Pearl showed Greta how to properly whip cream, real cream, thick and white and impossibly rich. "The trick is knowing when to stop," Pearl explained, her wooden spoon creating peaks that held their shape like small mountains. "Too little and it won't hold. Too much and you've got butter." Greta watched in fascination as the cream transformed under Pearl's patient guidance. Back home, cream had been a memory for most of the war, replaced by ersatz substitutes that bore no resemblance to the real thing. Yet here it was, abundant enough to be whipped for a prisoner's birthday celebration. "How do you know when it's ready?" Greta asked, taking over the spoon when Pearl nodded for her to try. "You'll feel it change," Pearl said. "The resistance gets different, like the cream is telling you it's ready to become something new." As Greta worked, she became aware of footsteps approaching the kitchen. Mac's voice carried through the doorway as he spoke with someone about the day's schedule, his tone carrying the easy authority she'd come to associate with him. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she felt her cheeks warm for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. "Morning, Pearl. Greta." He nodded to each of them, then surveyed the preparation in progress. "How's the birthday surprise coming along?" "Just about ready," Pearl replied, "though I think your assistant here might have some questions about American birthday traditions." Mac's eyes found Greta's, and she saw that same patient kindness that had troubled her so much that first evening. "What would you like to know?" The question came out before she could stop herself. "Why do you celebrate birthdays for prisoners? We're supposed to be your enemies." Mac was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My sister Mary used to say that birthdays weren't about celebrating the year that passed, but about marking the fact that someone had been given another chance to become who they were meant to be." His voice softened slightly. "She died in London during the Blitz, 26 years old, and I realized after we got the telegram that I'd never get to celebrate another birthday with her." Greta felt something tighten in her throat. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and it reminded her sharply of her own grief for her brother Hans. "I'm sorry. The way I see it," Mac continued, "a birthday is about recognizing that someone matters, that their life has value, regardless of what uniform they wore or what side of a line they happened to be born on." He gestured toward the cream she'd been whipping. Heinrich Müller may be a prisoner, but he's still a man who's lived 40 years, who has memories and hopes and people who love him. Seems to me that deserves acknowledging. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of the industrial milkshake machine hummed to life from the back corner of the kitchen. Greta turned to see Mac moving toward it, checking the ice cream supplies and milk that had been set aside for the celebration. "Would you like to help?" he asked, and something in his tone made her realize this was more than a casual offer. She found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. As she approached the machine, Mac began explaining the process. How much ice cream, how much milk, the importance of the right proportions. His hands moved with practiced ease, but she could sense his attention on her reaction. "The first batch is vanilla," he said, pouring ingredients with careful measurement. "Heinrich mentioned once that his daughter loves vanilla cake back in Munich." The machine whirred to life, blending the ingredients into something that looked impossibly rich and creamy. Greta watched the transformation, remembering that first evening when she'd laughed along with the others at such American excess. The memory brought heat to her cheeks. "We were very rude," she said quietly, "that first night, when you brought us the milkshakes." Mac's hands stilled on the machine controls. "You were scared," he said simply. "People do different things when they're scared. Some get angry, some get quiet, some laugh when they don't really find anything funny. But you looked," she struggled to find the English words. "You looked hurt." "I was," he admitted, meeting her eyes. "Not angry, just disappointed, I suppose. I'd hoped to show you that Camp Concordia could be different from whatever you'd been told to expect, but I understand why you couldn't trust that. Trust has to be earned, especially when everything you've experienced tells you to be cautious." The machine finished its work, and Mac poured the result into a tall glass. The milkshake was perfect, thick enough to hold its shape, pale ivory in color, topped with a generous dollop of the whipped cream Pearl had taught her to make. He held it out to her, and this time there was no audience, no peer pressure, no Irma to dictate what was acceptable. "Would you like to try it?" he asked. "Before we serve it to Heinrich?" Greta looked at the glass, at the condensation already forming on its sides, at the careful way Mac held it, not as a test or a manipulation, but as a genuine offering. She thought about Pearl's words, about stories in fear, about Mac's quiet insistence on treating everyone with dignity, about her own growing realization that everything she believed about this place and these people was built on foundations of sand. She took the glass, noting its weight, its coldness against her palm. The first sip was tentative, just a small taste to see if her expectations matched reality. What hit her tongue was a revelation, sweetness so pure and clean it made her eyes water, richness that spoke of abundance rather than waste, coldness that was refreshing rather than shocking. But underneath the immediate sensory pleasure was something more complex, the taste of safety, of abundance freely shared, of a world where there was enough goodness to go around. The flavor transported her instantly to her grandmother's kitchen before the war, when vanilla pods were still available and cream was something you could take for granted. It tasted like Sunday afternoons and birthday cakes and the kind of childhood security she thought was gone forever. But it also tasted like something new, like the possibility that sweetness could exist even in the midst of conflict, that enemies could choose to nourish rather than harm. She took a larger sip, then another, watching Mac's face transform as he saw her genuine reaction. His smile was gentle, satisfied in the way of someone whose small gift had been received in the spirit it was offered. "Good?" he asked, using the same simple English he'd tried that first evening. "Very good," she managed, though the words seemed inadequate to capture what she was experiencing. The milkshake wasn't just delicious, it was a revelation about possibility, about the choice to create beauty and pleasure even in circumstances designed for suffering. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the kitchen warm around them with the smells of cooking and the sounds of Pearl humming as she worked. Outside, Greta could hear the camp coming to life, voices calling greetings, the sound of marching feet, the normal rhythms of a place where people had learned to create community despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "I want to apologize," she said finally, "for that first evening, for laughing, for not understanding what you were trying to show us." Mac shook his head. "No apology needed, but I'm glad you understand now." He began preparing more milkshakes for the birthday celebration. Sometimes it takes time to learn that kindness isn't always a trick, that some people choose to share sweetness just because they can. As Greta helped him prepare the celebration, she found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from the propaganda-filled world of her youth to this Kansas kitchen where an Irish-American sergeant made birthday milkshakes for German prisoners. The transformation hadn't happened all at once, but in small moments of recognition. Pearl's patient teaching, Mac's daily kindnesses, the gradual realization that humanity could transcend the boundaries drawn by nations and ideologies. The milkshake in her hand was more than a dessert. It was proof that sweetness could survive bitterness, that abundance was possible even in a world shaped by scarcity, and that sometimes the most radical act was simply choosing to see enemies as people worthy of birthday celebrations and vanilla milkshakes made with care. When Heinrich Müller received his birthday surprise that evening, his eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with homesickness and everything to do with the recognition that he was still, despite everything, a man whose existence mattered enough to celebrate. And Greta, watching from across the mess hall, finally understood what Mac had been trying to show them from the very beginning. That dignity restored was a gift that transformed both the giver and the receiver. Summer deepened over Camp Concordia like a warm blanket, bringing with it a rhythm of life that Greta had never expected to find in captivity. The Kansas heat was relentless, but somehow comforting, different from the oppressive atmosphere of wartime Germany, where every sunny day had felt like borrowed time. Here the sun seemed to encourage growth rather than expose vulnerability, and with each passing week, the rigid barriers between captor and prisoner began to blur in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first fearful days. The English lessons had started almost by accident. Mac had been trying to explain new work assignments to a group of recently arrived German soldiers, his broken German creating more confusion than clarity. When Greta offered to help translate, she found herself naturally bridging not just languages, but cultural gaps that went far deeper than vocabulary. "The word they keep using is opportunity," she explained to Klaus Weber, a former schoolteacher from Dresden who'd been struggling with the concept Mac was trying to convey. "Not assignment or duty, opportunity, as if working in the camp garage is something we might actually want to do." Klaus raised his hand tentatively, addressing Mac directly in his careful English. "This opportunity is optional." Mac nodded encouragingly. "Optional, yes. If you prefer kitchen work or laundry, that's fine too. We try to match skills with tasks when possible. I understand you taught mechanics before the war?" The conversation that followed revealed Klaus's expertise with engines, his love for problem-solving, his frustration at being reduced to a rifle-carrying infantry soldier in a war he'd never wanted to fight. By the end of the session, he was assigned to help maintain the camp's vehicles, work that brought light to his eyes for the first time since his arrival. These informal translation sessions evolved into something more structured as word spread among both German prisoners and American staff. Mac would arrive at their designated classroom, a corner of the mess hall cordoned off during off hours, with a patience that never seemed to waver, even when faced with the linguistic challenges of explaining American idioms to people whose English came from textbooks. "The phrase is break the ice," Mac explained one evening, drawing puzzled looks from his mixed audience of German and Italian prisoners. "It means to start a conversation, to make people feel comfortable with each other." "But why ice?" asked Pietro Rossi, a former art student from Rome whose English was surprisingly good. "Ice is cold, unfriendly." Greta found herself jumping in before Mac could respond. "I think it's like breaking through a barrier," she said, surprising herself with her confidence in addressing the group. "Ice creates distance, makes it hard to reach each other. Breaking it means creating a way to connect." Mac's smile when he looked at her held approval and something else. Pride, perhaps, in seeing her comfort with language and explanation. That's exactly right, Greta. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who remember what it felt like to learn. These evenings became precious to Greta in ways she couldn't entirely articulate. There was something magical about watching men who'd been trained to see each other as enemies discover their shared humanity through the simple act of learning together. Heinrich would help Pietro with pronunciation, while Pietro shared sketches of their Kansas surroundings that captured beauty Greta had been too afraid to notice. Klaus would explain mechanical concepts to Mac, who listened with genuine interest despite his own expertise. But it was her private conversations with Mac, the ones that happened when they stayed after to clean up or prepare materials for the next session, that began to shift something fundamental in how she understood the world. These talks started with language but meandered into territory that felt both dangerous and necessary. "You mentioned a sister," she said one evening as they stacked chairs, referring to his comment about birthdays during Heinrich's celebration. "Was she your only family?" Mac paused in his work, a chair halfway to its destination. "Mary was the youngest of four. I have two older brothers, one's in the Pacific with the Navy, the other's an engineer in Detroit building tanks. Mary was the one who wanted to see the world, so she took a job as a governess for an American family in London." His voice carried affection mixed with grief. "She loved the children she cared for, loved the city, loved feeling like she was part of something bigger than our neighborhood in Boston." What was it like growing up there? Greta found herself genuinely curious about his life before the war, before Camp Concordia, before their paths had intersected in this unlikely way. "Complicated," Mackie admitted, settling into one of the remaining chairs as if deciding the cleaning could wait. "My parents came over during the potato famine back in the 1840s. By the time I was born, we were American, but we were still Irish to a lot of people. Still Catholic in a mostly Protestant neighborhood, still poor in a city that was getting richer all around us." Greta pulled out a chair across from him, settling into a conversation that felt both forbidden and inevitable. "Did people treat you badly?" "Some did. Called us names, said we were taking jobs from real Americans, complained about our accents even though we were born here." Mac's expression was thoughtful rather than bitter. "But my father always said that being on the receiving end of prejudice taught us something valuable, how to recognize dignity in people who look different or sound different or worship different than we do." The parallel to her own situation wasn't lost on Greta. "Is that why you treat us the way you do? Because you know what it feels like to be seen as different?" Mac considered this. "Maybe partly, but also because my faith teaches that every person carries something sacred, regardless of what circumstances brought them into my path. The war will end eventually, Greta. The question is what kind of people we'll be when it's over, whether we'll be defined by the hatred that started all this, or by the choices we make about how to treat each other when we have the power to choose." These conversations became a bridge between them, a space where the artificial boundaries of prisoner and guard dissolved into something more human and complex. Mac told her about his pre-war work as a high school coach, his love for teaching young people to work as a team despite their differences. Greta found herself sharing memories of her family's small-town life, her brother Hans's dreams of becoming an engineer like their grandfather, her own interrupted studies in linguistics that had made her valuable to the Wehrmacht's communications corps. "What will you do after the war?" Mac asked one evening as summer cicadas hummed outside the windows. The question stopped Greta cold because she realized she'd stopped thinking about an after. For so long, survival had been the only goal. Each day a small victory against circumstances designed to break people down. But here in Camp Concordia, with its rhythms of meals and work and evening lessons, she'd begun to imagine a different kind of existence. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything I planned before, it all seems to belong to a different person. Someone who believed different things, who thought she knew how the world worked." She looked at Mac, this man who'd become so much more than a captor. "What about you? Will you go back to teaching?" "I hope so, but I think I'll be different too. This experience, meeting all of you, learning about your lives, seeing how quickly enemies can become, Well, not enemies, it's changed how I think about education, about what it means to really teach someone something important. The golden quality of summer light during these conversations made everything feel suspended in time, as if Camp Concordia existed in its own pocket universe where the usual rules of war and nationality didn't apply. Greta began to look forward to these evenings with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She was falling into friendship with a man she was supposed to hate, finding herself caring about his stories, his losses, his hopes for when the fighting finally ended. But even as the days stretched into a routine that felt almost peaceful, Greta couldn't shake the awareness that this golden time was borrowed. Wars ended, prisoners were transferred or repatriated, and the real world beyond Camp Concordia's fences continued to churn with violence and upheaval. Letters from home, when they arrived through Red Cross channels, brought news that grew progressively darker as Soviet forces pushed deeper into German territory. Her mother's careful descriptions of liberation couldn't hide the fear between the lines, the growing awareness that defeat would bring its own forms of suffering. Yet somehow, in Mac's presence and in the community they'd built around their evening lessons, Greta felt herself holding on to hope she hadn't known she possessed. Hope that the qualities she'd discovered here, dignity transcending circumstance, kindness choosing to flourish despite every reason for bitterness, might somehow survive the transition back to a world that seemed designed to crush such delicate growth. The Golden Summer was teaching her that humanity was more resilient and more creative than she'd ever imagined. The question was whether that lesson would matter when the inevitable changes came, when the protective bubble of Camp Concordia gave way to whatever harsh realities awaited beyond its boundaries. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early August, delivered by a Red Cross courier who looked apologetic as he handed Mac the official envelope that would change everything. Greta was in the kitchen helping Pearl prepare lunch when she heard Mac's footsteps approaching, heavier than usual, carrying the weight of news he clearly didn't want to deliver. "Ladies," he said quietly, appearing in the doorway with the kind of careful composure that immediately put Greta on alert. Pearl looked up from the onions she was chopping, her experienced eyes reading his expression with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to recognize trouble before it announced itself. "What is it?" Pearl asked, setting down her knife. Mac's gaze found Greta's face, and she saw in his eyes the same look he'd worn that first evening when they'd rejected his milkshakes. Hurt, but this time mixed with something that looked like dread. "Orders came in this morning. The women are being transferred to a different facility next week for enhanced interrogation about military communications networks." The words hit Greta like a physical blow, but it was the phrase "enhanced interrogation" that made her blood turn to ice water. She'd heard enough whispered stories from other prisoners to know that such language rarely meant what it claimed to mean. "When?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Monday morning. Transport leaves at 0600 hours. Mac's jaw was tight, and Greta could see the muscles working as he struggled with whatever he wasn't saying. "I want you to know that I've submitted a formal protest through proper channels. Your cooperation here has been exemplary, and there's no justification for—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Greta. I tried." The remaining days passed in a strange, suspended animation, like the last moments before a storm breaks. The other women reacted to the news with varying degrees of resignation and fear. Helga cried quietly at night, muffling her sobs in her pillow. Irma retreated into the brittle hardness that had served as her armor from the beginning, though Greta caught her staring out windows with an expression that might have been regret. But it was Irma's transformation on their final Saturday that stunned everyone. Mac had organized what he called a farewell dinner, though the atmosphere felt more like a wake than a celebration. The mess hall had been decorated with wildflowers that Pearl had gathered from the fields beyond the camp, and the kitchen staff had prepared the best meal any of them had eaten since arriving in America. As they sat around tables that had become familiar, eating food prepared by people who'd become something approaching friends, Irma suddenly stood. "I need to say something," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the room. The conversation died as all eyes turned to her. "I was wrong." The words seemed to cost her considerable effort. About this place, about these people, about what Americans would be like. She looked directly at Mac, her composure cracking slightly. I spent months trying to protect all of you from kindness because I thought kindness was another weapon. I was wrong about that too. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion no one quite knew how to express. Finally, Mac stood as well, moving toward the kitchen with the purposeful stride Greta had learned to associate with his small acts of grace. When he returned, he was carrying a tray laden with tall glasses filled with that familiar, thick, white liquid topped with peaks of whipped cream. 5 milkshakes, just as there had been on that first bewildering evening, but this time the women didn't laugh. This time, when Mac set a glass in front of each of them, they understood it for what it had always been, an offering of dignity, a gesture that said their humanity mattered regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Greta lifted her glass and took a long, slow sip, letting the vanilla sweetness coat her tongue while memories of the summer played through her mind. The first taste of real kindness in the kitchen with Pearl, the evening English lessons that had become bridges between worlds, the quiet conversations with Mac that had taught her that enemies could choose to see each other as people worthy of respect and care. Even Irma drank, and when she did, tears began rolling down her cheeks, the first tears Greta had ever seen from their unofficial leader. "It tastes like childhood," Irma whispered, "like before we learned to be afraid of each other." They savored the milkshakes in contemplative silence, each woman lost in her own thoughts about what this strange summer had meant, what they would carry with them into whatever came next. Outside, the Kansas sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, the kind of beauty that insisted on existing despite the human capacity for creating ugliness. That night, as they packed their few possessions, Mac appeared at their barracks door. Greta had been expecting him, somehow knowing he wouldn't let them leave without some final gesture, some last attempt to send them into uncertainty with whatever protection his influence could provide. "There's been a change," he said, and his voice carried something that made all 5 women freeze in their packing. "I've spent the last week pulling every string I could think of, calling in favors, writing letters to people I served with who've moved up in the world." He paused, and Greta saw him swallow hard. "Instead of the interrogation facility, you're being transferred to a Red Cross work program in Denver. It's not freedom, but it's not what you were facing either. You'll be able to earn wages to send to your families, learn skills that might help when this war finally ends." The silence that greeted this news was profound, broken only by Helga's sharp intake of breath and what sounded like a muffled sob from Irma's direction. Greta felt her knees go weak with relief so intense it was almost painful. "Why?" she asked, the question coming out as barely a whisper. Mac looked at each of them in turn before answering. "Because what happened here this summer, the way you integrated into camp life, the way you helped with translations and teaching, the way you showed that people can choose to be decent to each other even when everything says they should be enemies, that matters. It matters enough to fight for." Monday morning came too soon and too slowly, depending on the moment. As they loaded their few belongings into the transport truck, Greta felt the weight of transition settling over her like a heavy coat. Denver would be different. The Red Cross program would have its own rules, its own rhythms, its own challenges. But whatever came next, she would carry with her the knowledge that kindness was possible between enemies, that dignity could survive the worst circumstances, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply choosing to see another person's humanity. Mac stood by the mess hall as their truck prepared to leave, his hands clasped behind his back in the stance she'd come to know so well. As the engine started and they began to move, Greta found herself at the small rear window watching him grow smaller in the distance. She raised her hand in a gesture that wasn't quite a wave and wasn't quite a salute. Something new, something that belonged to the strange friendship they'd built across enemy lines. 6 months later, from her desk at the Red Cross facility in Denver, where she worked as a translator helping reunite separated families, Greta would write Mac a letter on Red Cross stationery. She would tell him about her work, about using her language skills to heal rather than wage war, about the German family she helped locate American relatives, about the American family she helped find loved ones in Europe. She would tell him that his kindness had changed not just her understanding of Americans, but her entire concept of what was possible when people chose connection over fear. And she would end the letter with a phrase he'd taught her during one of their evening English lessons, words that carried the weight of everything their unlikely friendship had meant. "Thank you for showing me the taste of hope."